Hi, this is Lauren from the Office of Historic Alexandria, and welcome to the toy quilt tutorial. I'm going to show you how to make a small blanket for a toy. This tutorial will cover basic hand sewing techniques for beginners. We'll use 8 5x5 inch squares to make a small blanket that looks something like this. First, we're going to thread the needle. Cut a piece of thread that is about twice the length of your arm, not too long. Put one end of the thread through the eye of the needle, that's the hole. Hold the two ends together and pull the needle away from the end so the needle is in the middle. Holding both thread ends together like they are one thread, tie a knot about 1 inch from the ends. Tie another knot so that the first knot gets stuck in the second knot. You might have to tie a few extra knots before you get 2 knots on top of each other. It takes practice. Now we're ready to start sewing. Get 2 of your 5x5 inch squares of fabric. Place the right sides of the fabric facing each other. The right side of the fabric is the nicer side that should be visible in the end. Sew along only one side, a 1/4 inch from the edge of the fabric. Sewing a straight seam a 1/4 inch from the edge of fabric is easier if you use a pencil and a ruler to draw a line where the seam will be. It's okay if it's not perfect, but it's more important that your seam is straight as opposed to a 1/4 inch from the edge of the fabric. If you want to do 1/2 inch seams, that's okay too. Start sewing by piercing the fabric with the needle on the top, and then grabbing a little bit of the fabric with the tip of your needle, and your needle pokes back out, push it through, and then pull the needle tip through the fabric from the top. Each stitch is like a little scoop of fabric. Always sew from the top, holding the fabric with your other hand. If your stitches look more like my 6-year-old's than mine, that means you're doing a great job as a beginner. Keep making stitches until you get to the other end of the fabric. Sewing a seam is like drawing with thread. You're drawing the line that you probably already drew with the pencil. Once the seam is finished, knot the thread as close to the fabric as possible. Try to knot the thread a second time, getting the first knot within the second knot, just like when you threaded your needle earlier. Cut the thread. Now you've made your first seam. Open up the fabric and admire your work. Now repeat this 3 more times so that you have 4 pieces that look like this. If you can, iron your seams flat. If you don't have an iron or you don't have the time, you can press the seams flat with your fingers. Ironing your seams is a very important step in sewing. Now we're going to piece together 2 of those rectangles to make the top of the quilt, and then the other 2 rectangles to make the bottom of the quilt. So place them side by side the way you want your quilt to look, and then close them like a book so the right sides of the fabric are together, facing each other. Try to line up the center seams. It's more important that the pieces line up by the center seam than by the edges of the fabric, because it will make the quilt look nicer in the end. You can pin your fabric pieces together so they don't shift out of place while you're sewing. Draw your seam line. Sew the rectangles together along one of the long sides and finish the seam with the knot at the end. When the fabric is unfolded and laid flat, it should be a square of 4 pieces of your fabric. Repeat this with your other 2 rectangles of fabric, and then you'll have 2 squares of fabric about 9.5 inches by 9.5 inches, and these are your front and back pieces to your quilt. Remember to iron your seams flat. Now let's sew the front and back together. Place the 2 squares right sides together, lining up the seams as close as possible. If it's not perfect, that's okay. To help the fabric stay in place, you can use pins or safety pins to pin the fabric together and remove the pins after sewing. Start sewing in the middle of a side, not at a corner. Sew 1 continual seam along all 4 edges, finishing the seam about 2 inches from where you started. You can see that I used 3 separate pieces of thread to sew this. I sewed to this point, knotted, and started a new seam because I didn't want my thread to be too long to begin with, otherwise I wouldn't be able to easily pull it through the fabric as I'm sewing. Now turn the quilt right side out. You can use the eraser end of a pencil to poke the seams out from inside. Flatten the edges of the quilt as best you can. And as always, I recommend ironing them too. Now we need to sew up the opening that I left so I could turn the fabric inside out. Make sure the raw edges of the fabric aren't poking out. That's the fray edge. Now sew the hole closed as close to the edge of the fabric as possible. It's okay if we can see the thread. All done. This is a great place to stop if you want. Your toys will be cuddly warm all winter long. If you're ready for a little more crafting, you can quilt your quilt. A true quilted blanket is one where the layers are sewn together using visible stitches or quilting stitches. A common method of quilting is to stitch along the seams of the pieced together fabric, or you can make a more decorative design by sewing a pattern in the middle of the fabric pieces, like a swirl, multiple lines, a heart, or a circle. To sew a more decorative pattern, draw the pattern on the fabric with a pencil, then stitch along the lines like you are drawing with thread. I'm going to do a mix of techniques on my quilt. I'm going to stitch along the seams, and I'm also going to do 2 decorative circles in the middle of my fabric patches. I'm going to use a circle that I found around my house as a template to make sure my circles are both the same size. For sewing the quilting stitches, I'm going to use a single thread instead of the doubled thread because quilting stitches don't need to be as strong as the seams we made earlier. Since I'm sewing just in the middle of fabric and my seam isn't going to be hidden, I'm going to try and hide the knot in the end of my thread by starting at a seam and sending my needle through the 2 layers of fabric and poking out on the line where I want to start sewing. To hide the knot in your thread, at the end, you pull your knot through the fabric. The little tug can get it to pop into the fabric and then you can't see it. In the end, my quilt has 2 quilted circles and I quilted along the seams. All done. Good night, Mr. Hedgehog.